Welcome back. It's a special edition of The World This Week after the attack in Nice, which could turn out to be bloodier than that of the Bataclan here in Paris back in November. A 31-year-old man, a Tunisian citizen, a truck driver who had lived in the Nice area for years, who rammed his vehicle into crowds who'd been attending the Bastille Day fireworks display on Nice's famed Promenade des Anglais seaside boardwalk. Standing by there from our partners, the Daily Beast, the foreign editor Christopher Dickey, also from the Daily Beast, Paris correspondent Aaron Zaleski. We're with Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review and France 24's very own Robert Parsons. You're near the Promenade des Anglais there, Christopher. Tell us exactly what's, because we can see there's like a flower display next to you.
Yeah, it's one of those places. It's the nearest the public can get to the scene of the slaughter last night. And so they've been putting stuffed animals, because so many children were killed. They've been putting flowers there. They're putting signs, some of which are very political. Daesh, that's ISIS, murderers. And then says Erdogan is complicit with them, the president of Turkey. It's the kind of thing that we see when tragedies unfold. People want to come out and make a demonstration of their support and have some kind of emotional release. We saw it in Paris. I know you and I both were down in the areas around Paris after November 13th, where so many people were killed, and there were the same kinds of demonstrations. The actual death toll happened a couple of hundred yards to my right here, down past, in front of and past the Negresco Hotel. The truck finally rolled to a stop in front of a building that's about 250 yards from where I am. It was there all day. I think it's been towed away now, but you could see the windshield was just riddled with bullet holes, where finally they were able to kill this guy and stop him from killing more people.
Christopher, the hard-right mayor of Nice, Christian Estrosi, this morning talking about why wasn't more done, for instance, with stripping of nationality, this sort of thing. You're in a place that's been something of the heartland for the far right.
Well, that's right. But there are also large parts of the Muslim community that work with the far right, work with Estrosi, and work with people, the sort of Franco-Français elements here. This is a very complicated melting pot. I mean, Nice, as you know, used to be part of Italy in the 19th century. It's a port city, so it's always had a great mix of populations, very large Muslim population in Nice, northern Nice, which gave rise, for instance, to Omar Umsen, who was one of the leading jihadist recruiters in France in the first half of this decade. So it's a complicated kind of environment here, and I think to start talking about nationality tests and all those kinds of things is just going to add fuel to an already smoldering fire, which is, of course, what the jihadists would like to do in the first place.
Robert Parsons?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Christopher's saying, though. This is what the jihadists want us to do, and we have to be careful in not overreacting to the challenge. And we have to explain. We have to engage with people throughout France or throughout Europe. And remember, too, that Europe has faced these sort of challenges in the past before. Sure, the violence is terrible now, but Europe has been through similar periods of violence before as well. And I found online today from an organization called Datagrave, which has been looking at peaks of terrorist violence since the 1970s to the 1920s. I don't know whether you can, to the where we are now, to 2016. I don't know whether you can make that out or not. But basically what it's showing is the 1970s here, the number of people killed by terrorist violence and the number of terrorist attacks was actually considerably higher than the levels of people killed and the number of attacks we're seeing today. There's been a spike since the end of the 1990s, but actually the levels faced through attacks from Basque terrorist organization ETA, the Red Army faction in Italy, and the IRA in Ireland, put together amounted to a more concerted attack on Europe than we're facing now.
A more concerted attack, but there's the perception.
There's the perception, and also we were talking about this earlier on, it's where it's coming from as well. These were indigenous terrorist organizations. What we're seeing now, to a large degree at least, not entirely, is coming from outside, and that changes the nature of the threat.
For me, it sort of leads into this debate that has been taking place here in France between the two leading Islamologues or experts on Islam, Gilles Kepel on one side and Olivier Roy on the other. Gilles Kepel, who argues that what we're witnessing is the radicalization of Islam in the form of radical Salafi preachers that have moved through France, that have recruited and sort of created more of a pool of potential recruits. And Olivier Roy, who argues that what we're seeing is the Islamicization of radicalism. And so that young men who at another time might have been recruited into political violence, whether far right or far left, or nationalist or separatist, are now being drawn into these movements embraced by transnational terror groups. Again, there's probably an element of both at work, but the contrasts with what Europe has been through in the past is striking. And one last thing, I think that as much as every time in the aftermath of this kind of horrible attack, the emotional outpouring is understandable. It's obviously understandable. At the same time, Europe and France have been through periods that were so much darker, so much more challenging, so much more at the cost of so much more lives. I think it's really important, for instance, when we talk about what politicians can do. I think that that's very important too, to really reinforce and make it clear to people we will get through this because we will.
So hold on, what you're saying is the new normal is not more terrorism. The new normal for most people is zero risk, zero problems.
In a sense, yes. But at the same time, when you look at what our grandparents' generation or great-grandparents' generation lived through, whether it was World War I, the Depression, World War II, even these periods of remarkable violence, Europe has gotten through to the point where now Europe is a place where it's inconceivable that there's the kind of mass war between France and Germany, for instance, that we witnessed throughout the last century or the first half of that century. Europe will get through. France will get through. And I think that if there's one action that the political class should take, that they can take, is to really reinforce that this is scary, it's painful, it's tragic, and we will get through.
And not to overreact.
Not to overreact. Aaron Zaleski, have politicians been up to the task?
I think as we're going to need a little bit more time to tell. I mean, again, I think, as was mentioned earlier, Fraçois Hollande is speaking as though he knows what this is and he has it under control. That's what politicians should do. But again, the details about this attack in particular are quite shadowy, and people are quick to point to Islamist terrorism. But then we have, on the other hand, back at the Paris attacks, we had people like the Abdeslam brothers, Salah, who's in prison, the sole survivor. From what everyone says, this guy was not this hardcore Islamist at all. He was this loser guy who was sort of disenfranchised. He ran a bar with his brother. He smoked a lot of pot. He really was not a part of society, and I think that there's this threat to look at too. These disenfranchised young men who feel like they've not assimilated into their communities, and they're vulnerable to the pull of this ideology, even though that exactly.
It seems to be quite a common profile for a lot of these characters.
Yes.
On that point, Christopher Dickey, there's another theory that I heard bandied about in the newsroom. I'll bounce it off of you, and that is, it's kind of the German wings theory. This is somebody whose marriage had collapsed and who said, I'm going down, I'm taking as many people as I can with me.
Yes, well, I think that's possible with this guy. There's always this attempt to categorize terrorists as if they must be in. Look at the Orlando shooting, for instance. This guy must be a frustrated homosexual, or he's really a jihadist, or it's not necessarily one or the other. It's a combination of factors. It's a poisonous mix inside a person's personality that can make them cross that threshold where they take the decision to commit mass murder. And I think it's not actually helpful to try and categorize these people in those kinds of simplistic terms. But just to take up something we were talking about earlier, when you're talking about the terrorism of the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s, the first part of the 90s, it was different. Why? Because there was someone that you could negotiate with. When you were talking about state sponsors of terrorism, whether they were Saddam Hussein or Hafez al-Assad or Yasser Arafat or any of these people, you could negotiate with them. There were political objectives that they wanted. They had political constituencies. That's not the case with ISIS. That's not the case with Al-Qaeda. These are millennial apocalyptic groups, and that's one of the things that makes them so scary. You can't come to an agreement with them. You can peel away some of their supporters. You can take them away from some of the masses that might give them tacit backing, but at the end of the day, you just got to kill the bastards, and that's what's going to be a hard job, but that's what's going to have to take place.
All right, the flag's flown at half-mast at the White House this Friday. We've had reactions across the globe. A wreath laid by the U.S. Secretary of State in the company of his Russian counterpart in Moscow as they were meeting at the French embassy. Flags at half-mast, as you can see in London, as the new Prime Minister called a security cabinet meeting and her new foreign minister spoke to reporters.
Obviously, our thoughts are very much with the people of France and Nice, and an absolutely appalling incident. Clearly, this represents a continuing threat. If this is a terrorist incident, as it appears to be, this represents a continuing threat to us in the whole of Europe, and we must meet it together. Thank you very much.
Is there any Britons involved?
Well, the only information that I have is that there is one UK national who is injured, but it's early to say at the moment. Thank you.
Robert Parsons, we had the jokes and the reactions all lined up for Boris Johnson, obviously, before the events in Nice happened. But again, at a time of Brexit, here we are with a problem that plagues the whole continent, and Britain won't be raising the drawbridge on this issue.
No, and interesting that he should be using those terms. Here we are with Europe together. And it has to be said with Boris Johnson, he says one thing one day and completely another thing the next. But yeah, this is clearly a moment for him to show gravitas. He's been put in an interesting position by his Prime Minister, Theresa May. He's responsible, essentially, along with one or two others, for the mess that Britain's got itself in. He's now been given the task of getting Britain out of the hole it finds itself in. Basically, she's given him enough rope to hang himself.
Another reaction. This one from the Polish Interior Minister. He said, Nice is the consequence of many years of multicultural policies and political correctness. This is how it ends. Robert Parsons.
Well, I mean, first of all, he's got his country wrong. France's approach to ethnicity, race relations is not a multicultural one. That's UK. First point. Political correctness, well, this reflects really just the drift of Polish politics over the last couple of years, Hungarian politics as well. We're seeing this beginning to creep throughout Eastern Europe. Poland and Hungary have been leading the way. It's clearly not the answer for Europe, and I hope nobody's going to pay very much attention to him.
At the same time, it's not what he intended to say, but if you read his words very literally, this is how it ends. That's a very real possibility when we talk about the potential of provoking a civil war, for instance. When we talk about closing drawbridge Great Britain or Fortress Europe, when we talk about the end of the Schengen zone, what we're really talking about is the end of this vision of the European ideal of open societies, cooperative Europe, a continent-wide society that cooperates and has free flow and free circulation of people in addition to goods. If it ends, if that comes to an end, it could very well be the result of incidents like this. That's not what he meant, obviously. He meant that this is where multiculturalism leads. Proponents, obviously, of multiculturalism would argue the exact opposite, that a true multicultural approach that is open to otherness and that embraces diversity actually prevents this kind of incident.
He wants to, sorry.
What he really meant by multiculturalism is, oh, this is what happens when you let in a bunch of immigrants from
Yeah,
North Africa and the Middle East. That's what he was really saying. And
He's saying, put up the drawbridge.
exactly, much in the line with what Donald Trump typically tweets after each of these incidents,
Yeah.
a kind of "I told you so."
Yeah.
All right, you mentioned Donald Trump. He's officially named Indiana Governor Mike Pence as his running mate on Twitter this Friday, but in the wake of the Nice attacks has held off on a public statement till Saturday. Meanwhile, a Reuters Ipsos poll shows 37% of Americans view Islam unfavorably, with a perception skewed along party lines, Christopher Dickey. 58% of Trump supporters and 24% of Clinton supporters view Islam unfavorably. This polarization you were fearing earlier in our discussion, is it happening?
Well, look, I mean, if we're going to talk about the Republican Party, what have Republicans believed traditionally? They believed that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks when he absolutely was not. They have believed all kinds of crazy things, and they are filled with this kind of nativist and xenophobic attitude when it comes to Muslims, when it comes to immigrants of all kinds. Ironically, sometimes those immigrants become Republicans. When you look at, for instance, Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina, who comes from a family of Sikhs. But the basic reaction of the Republicans, the basic feeling of the Republicans who are supporting Donald Trump is the United States is a country for white folks, and everybody else can just back off. That's essentially what he and his supporters are saying.
Right, and getting back to Europe.
I think that's not the way you can run the United States of America anymore.
Getting back to Europe and that statement that we read out by the Polish Interior Minister, an attack like the one in Nice. How many votes more is it for the likes of Marine Le Pen of France, Geert Wilders of the Netherlands, etc.?
Well, I think a lot is going to depend on what comes out of the investigation here. If this guy was just a stray dog, if he didn't have any contact or particularly credible links to Islamic radicalism, then I think they're going to have trouble making that case. They still will, because they basically run xenophobic nativist campaigns. But they will try to take advantage of it. My first thought when I was looking at this last night was that this is the kind of thing that could make Marine Le Pen the president of France at some point. Because if there's a succession of attacks like this, if people continue to look over their shoulders and feel that they have no security living in the country they're living in now, that's exactly the kind of thing that she plays on. And she plays on it the way Donald Trump does in the United States, with simple solutions, with let's keep these people out, let's not mix them too much in our own society. She's very careful about the way she phrases that, but that's the message of her party.
Judah Grunstein?
I think that the natural assumption is that an attack like this will boost the far right, will boost the xenophobic vote, will boost the nativist or nationalist vote. At the same time, a lot of the polling also shows that, especially in the United States, for instance, that people at this moment also really look for someone who they believe is competent to actually handle the problem and who they trust to actually make them secure. That's an easier case to make in the United States, where the difference in terms of government experience and just general reasonability between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, there's a huge gap, and Hillary Clinton wins that polling overwhelmingly, pretty much consistently. Marine Le Pen, on the other hand, in France, she's a career politician, or she grew up in a political family. She's become a very well-schooled, disciplined politician. So she can, in some ways, sort of convey that sense of competence and responsibility. I'd say her major handicap right now actually is what she, at the moment, thought was her greatest victory, which was the Brexit, in the sense that when you see the kind of turmoil and when you see the economic suicide that the Brexit has caused Great Britain, or early stages of a terminal illness. I think that takes a lot of wind out of the sails when you're trying to sell the same program here for a country, France, that is even more integrated into the European project, whose economy needs the European market and the global markets as much, if not more, than Great Britain.
Well, certainly, and final point on this, Aaron Zaleski, the rage against the elites, and again, an attack like the one in Nice, will it fuel it even more? We heard the boos for Fraçois Hollande when he was in town.
Right. I mean, it definitely could. I mean, he's as people have mentioned before, he's a very unpopular president, and he already lost even more points by pushing through the labor reform. So now, if people can use another, well, you're incompetent. You can't even keep us safe from this sort of thing. I think it could definitely fuel greater anger.
Quick note on local color: Nice is a very, very right-wing city in a right-wing region that almost went for the National Front in the regional elections. So Hollande getting booed is not terribly surprising in Nice. When it starts happening in Lille or Lyon, then I think he's got more problems to worry about.
All right, so something to worry about. Judah Grunstein, I want to thank you. I want to thank Christopher Dickey, who's covering the story from Nice, Robert Parsons, Aaron Zaleski. We're joined now by James Creedon. It's our Media Watch segment.
Hi, Fraçois. So just to look at how some of the coverage online, a lot of political reactions, of course, coming in on Twitter from, for example, the mayor of Nice, who one of his tweets after the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the 13th of November, after Brussels, France and Europe is at war. So we're seeing a lot
and
of...
we've forgotten it's at war, he's saying.
Yeah, well, we have forgotten that France and Europe is in a state of war. Henri Guénaud...
Let me ask about this. Robert Parsons, is that the right language to be using? It's the same language, again, that François Hollande used on the night of November 13th. We're at war.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a particularly good idea. I think we should be a little bit more relaxed about this. Obviously, we're under stress, but there's no threat, I don't think, to the political system, to the lives we lead, if we keep cool about it, if we treat this for what it is, a terrorist threat from a small minority of the population of this country, and try to deal with it through intelligent methods, through intelligence first of all, but also, as we were talking about earlier on, through engagement with the segments of society that are most affected, positive engagement, trying to explain, trying to make sure that they buy into the values that we hold in our societies in Western Europe.
Also, Henri Guénaud, former minister under Nicolas Sarkozy's government, saying that if the military had been on site with a rocket launcher, the truck would have been stopped. So we're seeing reactions like this, which, from a personal point of view, what are we going to do? Have rocket launchers on every street in France whenever there's a public gathering? I don't see how that can be a solution, personally.
In the middle of a crowd of civilians, it might not end very well.
What could possibly go wrong?
Right. So we're in a state of war, rocket launchers everywhere. These are the sort of reactions we've been seeing coming out. Obviously, reactions coming from politicians around the world as well, and leaders. I won't even show you them giving their condolences to France. This was an interesting blog from an AFP correspondent in Nice. She was there to cover the festivities. Her name is, the headline of the article is Broken Hearted. Valérie Osh is her name. She thought her job was done yesterday evening when she published this photo and sent it back to head office here in Paris, the fireworks display.
People, by the way, for the Paris fireworks display, had to unpublish on their Facebook accounts.
Right.
Beautiful pictures of fireworks.
Well, she published this, went home, and then had to go back, and she said it was just really, really horrendous to experience what she personally experienced going along the Promenade des Anglais and witnessing the devastation. And so she's writing and giving her account of it there. Just to speak of the social media use, yesterday evening, you had what we've seen in recent attacks, also with recent attacks, open doors, porte ouverte, open doors, and these people, I suppose, offering shelter for what was. Many were worried at the time that it could have been there could have been an echo of what we saw in previous attacks, which is 2 or 3 different incidents around the city. Also, a baby who got separated from his mother via Facebook was reunited with his mother. A woman, a sort of a good Samaritan, took the abandoned child into her care and through social media reconnected with the mother afterwards. alerts. So that's, I suppose, a slightly one feel-good story in a pretty horrendous series of events. The government had, the Interior Ministry had put in place since the Paris attacks, I believe, a sort of an alert system using a mobile phone application, which actually didn't work. 3 hours later, the alert was sent out. So apparently they were summoned to Place Beauvau today at the Interior Ministry at 3 p.m. to explain the makers of that particular app. But Facebook's check-in facility was used for people to kind of confirm that they were safe. A lot of criticism of some of the media coverage last night, Fraçois. There were a number of incidents that shocked a lot of people. For example, on the France 2 network, which they've since apologised for this incident, but a man was being interviewed live on television next to the body of his wife, and a lot of people just felt that that was extremely voyeuristic and unfortunate coverage. There was also false reporting, a lot of that fueled by social media coverage, people fearing that there were kidnappings, that there were hostage takings.
The truck was full of explosives.
That's right, hostage takings in a hotel. A huge amount of false information circulating on social media, which was then being broadcast on TV channels. So a lot of criticism for French rolling news coverage last night.
Did you have a hard time sorting the wheat from the chaff when you were reporting? And
Not if you stay up all night. You don't, but you have to really, you have to be very focused.
That was Estrosi who said the truck was filled with weapons and explosives. It turned out to be 2 plastic fake rifles and a couple hand grenades that were not operational.
Mayor of Nice, yeah.
That's right. Just very quickly, a couple of images from social networks. People obviously saying that they're exhausted by the increasing frequency of these terrible attacks. And you have one meme, if you like, I am exhausted, je suis épuisé. Paris, Orlando, Istanbul, etc.
All right, many thanks for that,
François.
James Creedon. And speaking of messages, we want to thank our viewers for all the messages that you've been sending us and trying to reach out to the people of Nice. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in this special edition of The World This Week.